The hum of office lights buzzed overhead, a sound that TJ Edwards had grown to despise. It was a constant, droning reminder of where he was and what he was doing, wasting away in an office cubicle, filling out spreadsheets and answering emails that no one would ever read. He was drowning in work that wasn't his, pulling the weight of slackers who somehow got paid the same as he did. The job paid well on paper, but in reality, after the long, unpaid overtime hours and the mental exhaustion, it was barely worth it. But there was always the weekend. TJ lived for the weekends, for the freedom they provided. Every Friday after work, he packed up and drove into the wilderness, seeking the only thing that made life bearable: solitude. The deep woods were his sanctuary, a place where he could breathe, where the weight of the city and its endless expectations couldn't touch him. The moment he punched out, he was already thinking about the trees, the wind, the distant hoot of an owl, and the scent of damp earth. This weekend was no different. No, it was more than that. He needed this more than ever. The stress had reached a boiling point, and he could feel himself unraveling. He'd already packed his gear, his tent, sleeping bag, food rations, bear mace, and his trusty .30-30 Winchester rifle. The rifle wasn't just for bears, but for peace of mind. Out there, in the deep dark of the woods, it was better to be prepared for anything. He had scouted out a new location using his GPS. A dense stretch of forest further out than he had ever gone before. It was deep, untouched, the kind of place where no trails existed, where no weekend hikers would stumble upon him. He needed to be alone. By the time he reached the trailhead, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, creeping shadows through the trees. He locked his car, slung his pack over his shoulders, and set off, inhaling deeply. In a very short amount of time, he could already feel the tension in his body unwinding. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. He expected this, and it's what he wanted. The further from civilization, the less sound there was. No car horns, no chatter, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds. After a few hours of hiking, something changed. The silence wasn't just peaceful, it was absolute. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. TJ slowed his steps, his instincts kicking in. He knew the woods well enough to recognize that this was wrong. The only time the forest went this still was when a predator was near. His hand instinctively went to his rifle strap, ready to bring it up at the first sign of trouble. Then he heard it. A growl. Deep, guttural, and completely inhuman. He had heard bears growl before. This wasn't that. This was something else. Something much bigger. And then a second growl. A different tone, just as deep, but more primal. TJ slowly crept forward. He was high enough on the trail now that he had a decent vantage point through the thinning trees. He moved carefully, stepping onto soft earth rather than leaves or twigs, inching toward the natural clearing ahead. That's when he saw them. Two massive creatures, standing face to face in the clearing. One was covered in thick, dark brown fur, its body so massive and muscular that TJ could see every fiber of its bulging limbs. It had an ape-like face, a heavy brow, and long arms that nearly reached the ground. A Bigfoot. An actual, living, breathing Bigfoot. But it wasn't alone. Opposite of the Bigfoot stood a nightmare. A creature nearly as tall, but leaner, with black matted fur and an elongated snout filled with razor-sharp teeth. Its eyes glowed yellow in the dim light. It was canine in shape, but different. It was stretched, hunched, its hands ending in long clawed fingers. A dogman. TJ gulped. He had heard stories of both creatures. He always assumed Bigfoot was more myth than reality, a relic of folklore and hoaxes. But Dogman, that was something else. A thing of nightmares. A cryptid that was spoken of in hushed tones, always with an air of dread. And he was standing right in front of them, hidden behind a tree, watching something no human was meant to see. The creatures stood motionless for a moment, their bodies tense, muscles coiled like springs. Their snarls and growls filled the air, a violent, guttural communication of dominance and challenge. TJ could feel it in his bones. This wasn't a territorial dispute. This was personal. Then it happened. The dogman lunged first, moving with impossible speed. It slashed out with its claws, aiming for the Bigfoot's throat, but the massive ape beast was just as fast. It sidestepped, grabbing the dogman's wrist and twisting it violently. A sickening crack echoed through the trees. The dogman let out a snarl of pain but didn't slow. It twisted its own body, using the momentum to bring its other clawed hand across the Bigfoot's chest, raking deep wounds into the thick fur and flesh beneath. Blood sprayed across the forest floor. Bigfoot roared, a sound so powerful it vibrated in TJ's ribcage. It swung its massive arm, connecting with the dogman's side and sending it hurtling into a tree. The impact was brutal. The dogman recovered quickly, scrambling back onto its feet, foam and blood dripping from its mouth. TJ was stuck in place, unable to look away. His mind screamed at him to run, to get as far away as possible, but his body refused to listen. He had heard of fight, flight, or freeze before. He had always assumed he'd be the type to run. But he was frozen, locked in place, witnessing a battle of monsters. The dogman charged again, this time low to the ground, moving like a blur. The Bigfoot braced itself, but the canine beast fainted at the last second, leaping up and over, landing on the Bigfoot's back. It sank its teeth deep into the Bigfoot's shoulder, blood splattering against its dark fur. The Bigfoot howled in agony, but it wasn't done. It reached over its shoulder with one massive hand, grabbing the dogman by the scruff of its neck and yanking it free. With a primal roar, it swung the creature over its head and slammed it into the ground with earth-shaking force. The dogman gasped, momentarily stunned, but the Bigfoot didn't give it a chance to recover. It lifted the canine beast off the ground and hurled it into a nearby tree, snapping thick branches like twigs. TJ stared in complete awe. His hands were shaking, his entire body trembling with the sheer intensity of what he was seeing. The fight wasn't over yet. The dogman was getting back up. Its ribs were heaving, eyes burning with rage. The Bigfoot was bleeding heavily now, its fur matted with crimson, but it stood tall, towering over its foe. This felt like a war, a battle that had likely been brewing for years, maybe even centuries. And TJ was the only witness. The dogman shook its head, blood trickling down its snout as it let out a low, guttural growl. It was wounded, but far from done. Its muscles coiled, the glow in its eyes intensifying as it studied its opponent. The Bigfoot, breathing heavily, widened its stance, its massive chest rising and falling with each breath. It was bleeding, but there was no sign of backing down. Then, as if some unspoken agreement had been reached, they charged at each other again. The Bigfoot swung a massive fist, catching the dogman in the ribs with a sickening crunch. The dogman yelped, but retaliated with a clawed swipe that raked across the Bigfoot's face, leaving deep, bloody gashes. The ape-like creature roared in pain, but instead of stepping back, It used the moment to grab the dogman by the throat. TJ flinched. He could hear the strangled, gurgling sound as the Bigfoot's massive hands clenched down on the dogman's windpipe. It lifted the beast into the air, its thick fingers digging deep into the fur and flesh beneath. The dogman thrashed violently, kicking its powerful legs, claws slashing at the air. Then, in one fluid motion, it twisted, using its sharp hind claws to rake down the Bigfoot's exposed stomach. The force of the attack forced the Bigfoot to release its grip, staggering backward as it clutched its bleeding torso. The dogman landed on all fours, panting heavily. It bared its blood-stained fangs, saliva dripping as it prepared for the next strike. But the Bigfoot, despite its wounds, was already recovering. It let out another deep, guttural roar and charged. The two collided again. They clawed, bit, and struck with such ferocity that TJ could hardly process what he was seeing. He had never imagined a fight of this scale could be real, let alone be happening mere yards away from him. Then the dogman made a mistake. As it went for another bite, the Bigfoot was ready. With a quick, brutal motion, it grabbed the dogman's head, twisting sharply. A loud snap echoed through the clearing. For a moment, time went still. The dogman's body went rigid, its eyes wide with shock. Realizing it lost the battle, its body went limp. The Bigfoot released its grip, letting the lifeless body slump to the ground with a dull thud. It stood over its fallen foe, blood dripping from its wounds. Victorious, but at a cost. TJ's mind screamed at him to move, to run, to get out of there before the victor of this primal battle turned its attention on him. His body finally obeyed. He turned on his heel and bolted, tearing through the trees as fast as his legs would carry him. Branches whipped against his arms and face, but he didn't stop. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The only thought in his mind was making it back to his car. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he pushed forward. He could still hear the sounds of the forest behind him, the weight of unseen eyes on his back. Then he saw it. His car, parked just where he left it. He practically threw himself at the door, fumbling with his keys. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely get them into the lock. He finally managed to yank the door open and slid inside, slamming it shut and locking it with trembling fingers. He forced himself to breathe, to calm down. Then, something moved in the trees. The Bigfoot stood at the tree line, its massive, blood-covered form barely visible in the shadows. It was watching him. TJ's fingers gripped even tighter around the steering wheel. His entire body screamed at him to get the hell out of there. Slamming his foot on the gas, he tore out of the forest, leaving the towering figure behind him. Even as he sped down the darkened roads back to civilization, the image of the Bigfoot standing in the trees burned into his mind. This was the first time in a long time he could not wait to get back to the city. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, comment, and subscribe.